Today I'm going to start a standing figure sculpture, and I'm going to show you how you can start a standing sculpture with water-based clay with very minimal hardware. So I'm going to build my sculpture this way, and it might seem a little bit more odd because remember, clay weighs a lot and you build it up like this, but the problem is with water clay without any sort of armature is that it tends to kind of wobble around. So the way I do it, I put like this prong on the back of the sculpture, and that generally keeps the sculpture nice and firm, and I can still move it around until it hardens up. When it hardens up, we simply just remove this and we can get the sculpture fired. So very simply, this is just two pieces of pipe, and I put a little bit of a weld in the middle. You don't have to weld it. You could actually use one of those T's and have the same sort of effect. But the reason I welded this together is that afterwards I put these little screws on here. And if you undo it, you can see I can remove the pipe out and in. And this doesn't cost very much. It's only a few dollars, and I keep reusing this over and over. Now, I'm not a great welder, so this weld is horrible looking. They do have various types of sculpture armatures that hold your clay up when you're doing this, but I found that this is probably the cheapest. Unscrew it, and then I have another bolt here. And I've had this for years, so after I am done with the sculpture, I actually remove this bit, and then I have the pipe left over. But this is such a good way of doing, because I can move it around, and when I want to finally get this out, I just undo this, slide this out of the sculpture, and voila. Going down to the base, I have a standard wood type of base, but I put a piece of like a trash bag on top, and I just taped it. The reason I put a bag nowadays on the sculptures is that when you have your water-based clay on a piece of plastic like this, when the plastic, or when the clay shrinks, the water evaporates, it kind of like moves the plastic, and it doesn't crack your sculpture. So I'm sure you guys have seen me use this clay before, and I'll be showing you a little bit more. I'm using kind of waste clay a lot. So this is the clay that I've used in the previous one. Oftentimes too, this stuff is already kind of dry, so I need to make sure that it gets a little bit wetter before I can start using it. What I like to do for the bases, I really like to start out with new clay. And I'm about to take 1 to 2 inches worth of this clay and just put it as my base. I just want to make sure that I get a good start here and then slice it off. So I am going to plop it right over here. Now I want to figure out where the legs are going to be. So it's about here. So that's the beauty of this pipe. You can kind of move it to the front, but that also means that you have to be aware that it might be also in the way. So there is a downside of this system, is that as you're sculpting the back, this is going to be in the way a bit, but that's a small sacrifice for this sort of system. Just where the feet are going to be, I'm looking at my model, and the way I tend to go about it is that I will actually kind of make it a little bit thicker on the bottom than it needs to be, because I need to make the bottom part just a little bit thicker, almost like a triangle as you're heading up. It's a little bit unintuitive to sculpt like this, but it does work fairly well. Okay, so I have my base ready. I'm looking at my model, and I have this stick here. This is what I'm going to use for measuring. And oftentimes, I'll take a measurement of the midway of my model, and I'll actually break the stick in order to reflect that. I can actually use this as reference, the stick. If I was to put that as the midway, and that's the pubic synthesis, 2 of these sticks would be the entire sculpture. And that's actually a pretty decent size. So that means they'll go into kind of like the butt area. I'm going to have to hide it a little bit. But that's a pretty decent size. Now I can make it a little bit smaller if I wanted, but that's a pretty decent size. Something that you have to do as a sculptor. You have to look at the model and take some time to really look at it, look at the position. And you know, in previous times where I did sculpture in a class, I felt so rushed because you pay a model, and models tend to be expensive, but when you have the luxury of having a computer with access to photography and all of this stuff, you can really take your time. So I know a lot of artists online on YouTube, they work extremely fast. I tend to be the opposite way these days. I used to be very fast, but now I've slowed down. I don't know why, but I think I kind of like to look at things a little bit more carefully. And that's the way I approach things now. But generally, I think a lot of people in the beginning, they approach it much faster than they need to. So I'm looking at my model and I'm trying to determine how I'm going to position things. I know that his right leg is here. He's putting his weight on his left. So he's got a little bit of contrapposto going. And then the left shoulder slumps in because it's a contrapposto. So your body is kind of counteracting where you put the weight. So if you put your weight on your right foot, you do that with your shoulder to compensate. It's the opposite. So it's a really nice kind of contrast that you have. And it makes a very stiff sort of pose look exciting. Contrapposto does that. When you look at 3D artists, the T-pose that they do, it's like this. You have equal weight on 2 feet. It's a very stiff pose, but the way they like look at it, they just need it for reference because they use bones to rig up their model, so it doesn't really matter. But if you're a traditional sculptor, you use the contrapposto because that's the most fluid and it's an exciting way of having your model pose. Very simple. You can put any model in a contrapposto pose and it looks great. So I'm looking at the model and I am going to start. And it's always very difficult for me to start because it's a commitment. Now I'm probably going to do it fairly quick. I like to leave these sticks here for support. And I think I'm going to put this on the left leg. I'm actually going to skewering it down to the base. What I like about these sticks is that they're very flexible, but you don't want to be too flexible here. And you can take some liberty. So the hips are going to be right about here. I'm going to put the torso here and bring it all the way up to the head. So the head is going to be maybe here. So let's get started. I can take large shapes of the clay and sculpt them. So if I'm sculpting like a torso, I could make kind of like a T shape and that'll be that. It really helps out and it's much easier than taking smaller steps. So this top part, I'm just going to like slice off because I want it to be a little bit nicer to work with. I am going to use this clay. It's perfectly fine. This has got grog in it, so it's a little easier to fire. So as far as the lower body, I'm actually going to, that'll be that. I'm actually going to cut this in half here, and I'm going to take, and I should have done a little bit more. All right, I need just a little bit more support for the legs. So I'm just going to take a used chunk. If you look at it, that's a lot of, and I'm just going to take care of this, make sure that it sticks on here, and I'm just going to like push it down. I need this to adhere really well to the base. And that's right, this is 2 legs that I'm using. So I'm trying to keep this simple, and at the same time I need it to support. Remember, this pipe is going to be going to the right about the buttocks area, and I'm going to cut that. And now I'm going to take the other slab of clay. There we go, look at that, we're starting to get somewhere. And I'm going to cut this like that. And that, right about here, is going to be where the lower back is going to be. So the size could still change, it doesn't matter. It's more important to get some of the general shapes. Remember, standing poses are much harder to do in water-based clay when you don't have a proper armature. So here's the pipe, and I'm going to simply just going to push this into the back. And all that does is support it while I sculpt. That's going to give me a little bit of support. You know, Rodin used to sculpt, but he did a lot of armatureless sort of terracottas, and I like those a lot. Like when you look at the Balzac, that's that portrait that he did of the guy like this. It's like a triangle going up. That's the way you can approach a armatureless sculpture. So I'm just going to take this. And often I've had like sculptures like this as I'm building them fall. So keep that in mind. It's just a much more difficult type of sculpture. If you are learning how to sculpt, you want to do it a sitting pose, a lying down pose, but that poses a few more things because it's a little bit easier to measure when you have something upright like this. So remember, this is about 2 heads, 2 sticks tall, about that. So I'll need a little bit more. I don't know how much more I'm going to add to the top, but let's go ahead and do that. I can put it here. But the problem is when you have weight like this, I mean, this thing gets pretty heavy. You have to be careful about keeping things this tall. And this, I'm about to kind of start cutting down on this. I'm also going to add more clay here. You see how just flexible this is? I'm just going to start cutting. I might make it just a little bit smaller in the beginning and completely remove the head. All right, just add some clay here. I'm going to add some clay around the pipe. That's going to create a little bit more support. Make sure you push in the clay pretty well. You don't want this to come apart. So I'm just going to work on the gesture. I'll give you guys some idea what I'm doing because right now it just looks like a huge mess. But this is a kind of a classical way of approaching sculpture. Another really great tool to have for this sort of style is the foil, a Coke can. And this is such a great tool. Using this to sculpt is amazing. And you do this, just get rid of that lumpiness right off the beginning. I don't know if you guys could tell, but that's completely gone. You know, the first day of a sculpture like this is really just the support and structure. I just work on very basic stuff. It might take a while, but just kind of concentrate on having something that's not going to fall apart. Here midway, hips are going this way. So that's the direction of the hips, and the shoulders are going to be right about there. So I'm looking right there is the left leg. The right leg kind of comes out to the front. So if you're looking at it this way, we actually have to have a little bit more to that leg. And then, this is important, this line, you want to exaggerate this. Imagine seeing the spine to the front or the back. This S-curve is really like what artists try and do. They continue this line like to the foot. So if you were to look at your body as you contrapposto, here's the spine going down, kind of exaggerate that, makes it a stronger sculpture in my view. And then the head kind of faces this way. We haven't figured out exactly where that's going to be. So you're going to get the chest right there, echoing the shoulder girdle. Then you have your arm right about here, your other arm right about there. There's going to be a negative shape here in between the legs, but I wouldn't worry about that just yet. But right now, we're going to add the shape to the front leg, because remember, it comes out. This looks flat, so it's not like that's what we want. We don't want to have this weird flatness. Weight bearing leg. I mean, this doesn't look like very much at all yet. So it really helps to have your model change often. Usually in art classes, every 10 minutes they move the model. So right about here, I'm going to just slice a little bit of the back, even though I don't want to be slicing too much. And I'm going to add clay where the base is, because this is going to be a very weak point. You want this to be strong enough, and also when you remove it, you don't want it to leave such a large cavity that's going to collapse. And what happens as you're sculpting, even day by day, this kind of sinks down a little bit. That's the bad thing about no armature, but you kind of get used to it, and you just kind of learn to kind of prop up your sculpture like this. Just kind of push it up. These little sticks, I like to use them because I can skewer where I think the bones are. So for this right leg, I'm just going to take this, and I'm kind of like looking at my reference and comparing the angle. I'm going to start here, just kind of putting it this way, and it helps you to kind of figure out where it's going to be. Also, I'm getting like these mosquitoes inside here, but let me now, I put it on there, and if I look at more reference, I'm actually not too happy with the way he has the leg. So from the front part, I can tell that he actually has it more this way. So I'm going to start it here, and you can exaggerate this a bit. So I'm going to take this again, I'm going to add where I want this to go. Right about there. He's kind of helped me guide what the middle is going to be. So, you know, these things are extremely handy. You could also use calipers, but I find that this is pretty darn good. So this one comes there to the middle. That's where the pubic synthysis is. And I can take measurements from here. And then just using this, I can kind of line it up like this, and I can tell where I need to go to fill the rest. So the head is going to be right about there. So that means that the shoulders are right here. And the shoulders of this sculpture, because it's contrapposto, remember, weight is on this left leg. That means that the hip is going to be going up. So the hips are actually doing this, if I can kind of put it here. And then what the shoulders are doing is this. Let's see if I can put this on here so you guys can tell. Let me put some more clay. So that's what contrapposto is. It's simpler, and the more you exaggerate these things, the more dynamic it is, but you know, you don't want to go too overboard, but that's about what it is. And for this pose, he actually has it just a little bit more like this. So in reality, that shoulder is right there. Of course, this should be curvy because of the spine, but I'm just adding this as the midway. So right now, I am going to start putting in where I think that arm is going to be. So this is a rough idea of a sculpture, it's not finished, but of course I want to be able to add all the elements, or just a little bit. Oftentimes when I do the head, I don't put the entire thing. The neck is angled up like this. So if I look at it this way, and it's still kind of flexible, so we can kind of figure out what we want. Now I'm going to take the 2 sticks again, because I keep going back to my measurements. And it actually goes down a little bit. This kind of helps you figure out where the top of the head is. And now I'm going to take the clay and I'm going to wrap it. Just make sure you get, and I'm going to push it up just a bit. Because this clay, or this stick, I'm going to remove. And also keep in mind now, if this is the front of the sculpture, where you want your model to look. And I think for this sort of stuff, when you have the contrapposto like this, it's nice to have the model look this way. It's another dynamic way of sculpting, is to have the model look away. You could like make the head go this way, but I do like, it's a much more natural way to look to the right than to the left. So I'll just kind of sculpt a little bit of the head that way. Once this dries a bit, at least I'll know the direction of how I want the sculpture to go and to look. A lot of people, they create like a profile for the head. I tend not to do that. I prefer to sculpt the roundness right off the bat. And I'm just going to lay all of this in. I usually like to have the aid of a tool. And this could still move if I wanted to make the neck a little bit thinner and the trapezius, because I'm going to have to drop the shoulder, because right now it's a little bit angled, but I want to bring this down. But what you could also do is bring the right shoulder up. And I am trying to keep in mind that this could fall off the armature. Remember, it's just that pipe holding everything up. You definitely don't want to move your sculpture around when you're doing this. As far as like moving the stand, you want to be very balanced. So, and this arm is actually going towards the back, but it's the way he has his body, he is actually twisting the torso, but I'm not exactly sure how much I will be twisting. Now, I'll probably do that a little bit more in the next session. And remember, use your big tools for the initial stages, because people get caught up too caught up in details. If you use big tools like this, paint scrapers, flat wooden tools, it keeps you from doing useless detail that you're going to be erasing later on because you made a mistake. And in my way of sculpting, I make so many mistakes that you're better off doing that. So I'm just going to smooth the back out a little bit. Alright guys, I think I'm pretty much done for today with this. So this is pretty much what I'm leaving it at, and the reason I'm leaving it at this point is that it's too soft to really work on it too much. This is getting too thick, but I'm okay leaving this amount of clay tapering off to the top because I need some sort of structure to support this. Tomorrow I'll continue this and I will start adding a little bit more of the gesture. But for right now, I always try to like work on the structure of the clay. The next step is the gesture and the pose, and then I'll start doing the details. As per usual, thank you for watching. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.
Just when I think you couldn't possibly be any dumber, you go and do something like this. And totally redeem yourself!